Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Literature, Language, Culture, a Dialogue series from the Department of English at the University of Washington. Today, we have a special guest with us, scholar, educator, Stephanie. Stephanie, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Stephanie Clare. I work in queer and feminist studies and philosophy, literature, and science studies.
And can you let our different viewers and listeners know what they'll kind of learn-ish by the end of the episode?
What I'm interested in is whether we could imagine forms of queer care. And I'm especially interested in the question of queer care in this contemporary moment of Black Lives Matter meets COVID-19. And I think that this is a moment that requires and that calls for practices of care.
Thank you so much. If you're listening to this on the podcast edition, there's a link to the YouTube version in the description or the show notes, and vice versa. If you're watching this and you prefer podcast versions, there's a link in the description. I will add that both versions, you'll find a link to a reading list. Stephanie is kind enough to cover a lot of topics and texts, so we'll have that available to you if you want to read further about it. And the YouTube version, if you're listening, will have some of those pop up on the screen as well. And then the English department does have some new social channels that you can kind of keep up with the project on. It's at UW_ENGL for Twitter and Instagram. And then Facebook the same, just no underscore. So hopefully we can be in further dialogue with you there. And of course, like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments what your thoughts are. And I hope you all enjoy this episode. Stephanie, what did you bring to talk about with us today?
I brought the novel by Imogen Binnie called Nevada, a contemporary novel featuring a white trans woman in New York City whose life kind of falls apart. And it's not a hopeful novel. It actually starts like, this is not a happy novel. But I think it's actually a great text for thinking about the present moment and for thinking about what queer studies needs in the future.
Why this text, and why do you think queer studies needs it right now?
Queer theory emerges as like a critique of everything normal, right? And of a critique of like heterosexuality taken as normal, as the normative, as the gender binary is normative. Heterosexuality and the gender binary has been mobilized in the production of racial inequality and racial difference as well, and then challenging those regimes of normativity as well, okay? So that's kind of like, when people talk about queer studies is this anti-normative position, and it's against like homonormativity, so normativities of gay and lesbian lives, against cis normativity. So normativity over and over and over again. And I think that's really important, and I don't want to take away from that. But one of the things that this novel brings is what allows for the thriving of lives. And it's not only being anti-normative. The main character has all these anti-normative positions, and yet she's having trouble eating, she's having trouble accessing healthcare, she's having trouble sleeping, and she doesn't have a language where building communities of care might be something that's political and that might be important. And she's clearly searching for that, I think. So what I like about this text is that it shows the limits of anti-normativity, and it brings that at a time of both COVID and also at this point of juncture between like the pandemic and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, where the question of normativity and being anti-normativity becomes less clear.
A couple of questions. They can be kind of in any order. So one thing that I think might help from this outset is if you talk about how you're defining normative in this scenario. So when people hear anti-normative or that's normative, how that maybe departs from normal, right? And what normativity means.
Let's start by defining the normative. And that's actually hard. I think that it's a term that's used over and over again in queer studies and in queer theory, rarely defined. Regimes of normativity are generally understood as institutions, set of like common sense understanding as well. So like ideology and institutional practices that value particular people, behaviors, or traits, And part of valuing them is often by calling them normal or seeing them as average, or even not necessarily recognizing them as something. They become the status of the universal, and everything else is seen as different from it, outside of it, but it itself is not the focus. And I think one of the things that's confusing in queer studies is that we have talked about being anti-normative, and yet one of the ways that normativity works is by understanding that there's a range of behaviors, practices, people, and identities. And you don't have normativity without difference. So normativity is actually not about trying to make everyone the same, so much as about giving different value to difference. And that, I think, often gets missed. I think often when people understand normativity, they say, what we have to do is just assert our individuality, right? And we're going to critique normativity. But normativity is not about, you can't be anti-normative by holding on to the individual. It's rather by critiquing the valuation, the differential valuation of difference.
Can you give an example of what it looks like to shift from anti-normative only valuing individual to that kind of more valuing differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm going to go with Susan Stryker because I just have been teaching a trans studies class, and she has an early essay from the early 90s, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, where she's trans and she recognizes herself as having been positioned as similar to the monster in Frankenstein. And rather than reject that, she inhabits it, the position of the monster, and sees it as a position from which she can speak. And the position from which she can speak is that, or what does the monster say? The monster says that what you take as natural is in fact just as constructed as me, and that I am speaking from the chaos of nature beyond that construction, or on the other side of that construction at least. So that's an example where she's not just insisting on her uniqueness or her difference from the norm. She's valuing the position, and she's speaking from that position that ends the narratives that the normal says about itself.
So if we're talking about care, and I want to make sure that since you touch on some really rich theory, people can read up further, right? That we also talk about a book or something that you think helps illustrate what you're saying, what you have to say about care.
I'm going to start with Kai Cheng Thom's novel, Femmes and Notorious Liars, a confabulous trans girl's memoir. It's a novel that talks actually quite a lot about care. And actually that's very relevant to this contemporary moment. A trans girl moves to a city, and in that city she finds a community of other trans women, especially trans women of color. She's Asian North American, and what happens is that there's a murder of one of the members of their community is killed, and there's no justice is found. And at this community center they have a really big debate of what are we gonna do? And they decide to take to the streets, and there's a group of them. It kind of breaks up, but there's a group, and the protagonist is part of that group that decides that they're going to fight back and try to take back their neighborhood and their street and insist on no more violence, okay, through the means of violence. And they end up kind of accidentally killing a police officer. And through that, they themselves, especially the main character, she herself collapses. So the organization collapses and she collapses. And what happens? Well, she comes to bake a cake. She bakes a cake. The smell of the cake goes throughout the air all over the place. Everyone can smell the cake. And then they organize a spoken word night, and a night of storytelling where trans women are performing for trans women as well, because it's in a scene where often they're performing for others and for pay. And that is really healing. And what I find so interesting about the text is that it is showing that spectacular modes of resistance and even violence, and in part what is valorized in the text are these practices of care that are not about self-care and let me just go meditate. They are clearly about developing community, about fostering modes of living together. And there's one kind of elder of the community who's like opening her house for people who are homeless. And that is a practice of care. And it's been a really important practice of care in the history of like trans politics on the ground, like a STAR, for instance, housing homeless trans youth, gender nonconforming youth was a really important part of their project. And you see that. And that is political, right? So I think the novel is upholding practices of care and calling for practices of care. In feminism, in feminist theory, care was something that was really written a lot about, especially in the 1980s, starting with Carol Gilligan's work, where she argued that moral reasoning has been modeled on masculinist values that really value independence and justice and applying the rational, objective values to everyone in this kind of non-specific way. What she was arguing was that actually women practice other forms of moral reasoning that are more attuned with practice that we can understand as practices of care. Her work is interesting. It's also super limited. But in this current moment, I'm actually suddenly bringing myself back to it and trying to revisit it. One of the things she talks about in relation to care is that care requires an attentiveness to another. It requires this moment of listening and understanding. Care is not necessarily infantilizing. Good care is precisely not. Care is not something that just happens once and for all. It requires ongoing work and ongoing relationships.
Thinking about if you'd be willing to talk about how this kind of emphasis on thinking about other modes of care come back to these questions of the anti-normative and queer communities and trans communities and Black Lives Matter and all of that.
I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, though. So in queer studies, and one thing that I think is interesting is that we talked a lot about queer kinship. The text that we often turn to is Kath Weston's text, Families We Choose. It's a ethnography of gay and lesbian people living in San Francisco or in the Bay Area. And what she argues is that queer people, that our families are families that are chosen and they're not dictated by blood. And so she comes up with that phrase chosen family, or she doesn't come up with it, but writes about that phrase chosen family. Queer kinship has been seen as valuing non-normative family structures, but also valuing friendship and multiple different kinds of relationships and seeing those relationships are valid, that they are life-sustaining, that they are important. Kath Weston's work comes around the same time as Carol Sachs' work, which is a study of African-American practices of kinship. And it's emerging in the 1980s at a moment where there was a racist discourse used to legitimize the dismantling of the welfare state that argued that the African-American family is not strong and that Black men are not doing their role, doing their job in the family. And so it used an argument that African-American families are non-normative and, family values are non-normative and hence ought to be punished or not valued or cared for, actually, right? Quite literally, right? What I find interesting is that in queer studies, we've written a lot about queer kinship. David Eng's work is fantastic on that question as well. But often we don't talk about it in terms of queer care. And it's talked about in relation to kinship. Kinship is produced, obviously, in part through practices of care. So the two are not separate. But it's interesting the term kinship has taken hold, whereas care has a lot less. And I think in part, it has to do with how care has been connected, has been feminized, and how care is less easily understood as anti-normative, because care sometimes requires the repetition of the same over and over and over again for a form of sustenance. Whereas queer kinship, we can say look, these relationships are non-normative and they're fantastic, and they are. I don't, at all want to take that away from us. But there's almost some inherent tension between the term queer and the term care. And it's so ironic, as you're bringing up, because practices of care were called for and central in the context of AIDS, HIV/AIDS. And it's that very context, I think, that I locate the emergence of queer politics. So it's ironic that we've turned away from the importance of care.
So what I'm hearing you say is something that literature can offer, and the humanities maybe can offer as we look for hope, right? And all these different moments is different frameworks for caring for each other, right? That might not repeat the same type of violence. I'm thinking about how in the book you mentioned that the transformative one was actually the cake being baked and the smell of the cake and this very like, I agree, like very much feminized type of labor.
Totally.
Right? But it was actually that kind of care act that seems to catalyze a lot of momentum for the community flourishing.
Yeah, and I want to say that, like, I also see the role of the humanities as, I like to understand my teaching itself as a practice of care, and that we read these texts as in part like caring for our archives, but also caring for one another, and having moments of being able to discuss humanistic, just being able to discuss our lives, our loves, our losses, giving space for emotional and intellectual dialogue, I think is a practice of care. And I was so heartened, one of my students, I don't know if I can say his name, who's organizing like a queer reading group for this summer. And that's one of the things that he's moving forward from our class with. And there were several students who wanted to join. I love teaching queer and trans studies because it allows for intergenerational discussions of queer and trans politics in a way that's also not just like one-liners on like Instagram or Facebook or whatever, in the ways that we like really have conversations together. I see that as like meaningful forms of, of kinship even, but as practices of care, and how that can move outside of academia too. But I think that like film, fiction, poetry can all form, they provide moments of grounding or like objects around which we can form those communities. And that comes up actually in Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, the importance of like the storytelling night, bringing people together and telling stories, and developing community around that.
All right, Stephanie, thank you so much for covering so many different difficult topics today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your questions. It was great to chat.
Yeah. And then for those of you watching, we have to say it. You have to like and subscribe if you can. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're listening to this over a podcast, leaving a review in iTunes can be really helpful. And then you can be in dialogue with us on social, which are linked in the descriptions and stay at the beginning of the episode. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.